Barukot habaot, ladies, and welcome to our weekly Torah classes. And whether you're logging on to ohelsara.com or to Torah Anytime, you know how much we appreciate your dedication and devotion to Torah study. We want to thank all of the donors who donated the second Chag to our Pesach campaign. We so much appreciate your support. Kadosh Baruch Hu should just give you back all your mishalot libchem letova ulivracha, and all those in general who have supported us throughout the years, and especially through this Israel campaign. We thank you so very much. I truly, truly appreciate your tremendous generosity and your gestures, always coming through. Hashem yishmor otchem ve'ivarech otchem. And it should be now a bright season with renewed hope and miracles, Be'ezat Hashem. We have a lot of work to do, and I hope you all enjoyed the Chag and that it inspired you to move forward with hope for the coming redemption. At this point, as you know, we are counting towards the favorable holiday of Shavuot, where we're going to celebrate the giving of the Torah HaKadosha at Har Sinai. And as you could see, the Jewish calendar is constantly leading us from one Chag to the next with something new to look forward to accomplish, and to discover. You know, I find it amazing that Judaism never allows us to falter from the mission. We're always heading towards some goal, some purpose. Hashem is always giving us opportunity to elevate ourselves through the Chagim, because one Chag is leading to the other, with each of the Chagim as a stepping stone towards reaching the top of the mountain of spirituality. Having said that, there are steps that lead to Shavuot, beginning with the counting of the Omer. But on Shavuot itself, we have the custom of reading Megillat Ruth, the scroll of Ruth HaMoaviyah. And although Shavuot is 6 weeks away, I felt that we should begin learning the many lessons embedded in the story of Ruth. So we're going to have a few classes where we try to reveal many chidushim about the story, the people in it, and what we're meant to learn from their life, and how those lessons apply to us today in our generation. And it's my hope that we could all approach Chag HaShavuot with a renewed sense of appreciation for the female heroes in our story. I want us to understand what women can achieve and how important they are in the process of the Messianic movement. I want you all to learn to embrace your strengths and your instincts, and to utilize them for a greater purpose and a spiritual end, because every woman can draw from within her the resources and the ability to achieve, to discover, and to illuminate her surroundings with the power of her Kedusha. And we learn this from Megillat Ruth. Ruth is an iconic figure in Jewish history, and there's so much we could learn from her story. I mean, the story of Ruth HaMoaviyah comes right after Sfirat HaOmer, which is a time of mourning for Rabbi Akiva alav Shalom's 24,000 students who perished during this time period. And they did so because they did not afford honor one to the other. So after such a stark reminder of what could happen when we don't value each other, Pitom, we have the story of Ruth. Megillat Ruth comes along to demonstrate what amazing things can happen when we practice the Torah's commandment of loving our fellow Jew. ואהבת לרעך כמוך. זה באמת כלל גדול בתורה. Ruth was not born a Jew, but was accepted into Judaism because of the love that she felt for Torah and for the Jewish people. She arrived to Bethlehem together with Naomi as a pauper. But one thing that stands out about her is that regardless of her reality, she always held her head high and retained a deep respect for others. You know, in times of prosperity, it's easy to forget the times when we were faced with hardships, which can actually occur at any moment. One day you're rich, the next you're poor. One day you're happy, the next day you could be faced with many miserable nisyonot. But Ruth HaMoaviyah teaches us the great merits that we can earn if we don't compromise our values despite the hardships that we face in life. The story of Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi teaches us what could happen when you have unwavering hope. It's a Megillah that teaches us about loss and about healing. How despite any challenge, you could overcome. But without challenges and some suffering, one cannot rise or identify himself with others. Chachamim tell us that this is one of the reasons why we read Megillat Ruth on Shavuot, which is the time of the giving of the Torah. It's to teach us that the Torah is only given through the experience of suffering. Think about it. When did Am Yisrael receive the Torah? They received it 7 weeks following the Exodus from Egypt, where they were slaves to Paro for 210 years. Their suffering led to the greatest gift a person could receive in this world. And that's the gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah and the commandments in the Torah, and to be part of an Am Sgula, an Am Nivchar, a chosen nation, an Am which is classified as Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. But nothing in life is ever achieved, not really at least, without hard work and even some pain and some suffering. Chachamim tell us that Megillat Ruth is deemed as the book of punishment, very much like Sefer Iyov, because in both of them we're told about many calamities that came upon a wealthy person, a person that came from an honored family. And when we analyze Megillat Ruth compared to, let's say, Sefer Iyov, we find that Megillat Ruth encompasses all types of human tragedy, whether in a family setting or for the individual. But nevertheless, there is a big difference between Sefer Iyov and Megillat Ruth when it conveys its suffering. Because in Sefer Iyov, as you're reading the psukim, you could mamish, it's painful, you could feel this gust of suffering and grief that's blowing over you as you're reading the verses. While in Megillat Ruth, although we do read about the famine in the land, the death of Elimelech and his 2 sons, the sorrow, the merirut, the bitterness that Naomi felt, but somehow you just don't feel that intense grief and the pain as much as you do as you're reading Sefer Iyov. And that's because in Megillat Ruth, the suffering that Naomi and Ruth experience has a future that's filled with hope and with redemption. And that redemption flows from extraordinary kindness that both Ruth and Naomi display. You know, chesed is what this world was founded on. Olam chesed yibaneh, that kindness, that's an internal quality that many women possess, the chesed, and it's something Shlomo HaMelech alav shalom states in Sefer Mishleh, v'torat chesed al leshona, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. This is something that women have as an instinctive part of them. Chachamim teach us that, you know, kindness is not always equated with greatness. You could be kind, but it doesn't mean it's a great thing what you did. Meaning, as long as kindness is rational, logical, warranted, and justified by what we call normal considerations, it doesn't necessarily have to be equated with greatness. So you know when kindness does turn into greatness? According to the Rambam, this is how he puts it. He says, I'm going to tell it to you in English. When chesed reaches the dimension of the illogical and irrational, when someone who looks on thinks that what you're doing, the chesed that you're doing, is exaggerated or even unnecessary, that's greatness. That's greatness. I'll give an example. For example, if a friend of yours asks you to go with her for a walk in the park, and you did, you went, you did a chesed. You did a good deed with her because she needed to go out, and you went with her, she wanted to talk about something, you helped her. But it wasn't a great deed. It was a good deed, but it wasn't a great deed. However, if she came to your house and you cared for her in your house as if she was a member of your household, then you not only performed a chesed, says the Rambam, not only did you do a charitable deed, it was a great deed. It was a great, great deed. So Megillat Ruth demonstrated the illogical and irrational deeds performed by two women that placed each of them in the category of great women who performed atypical deeds, abnormal deeds, irrational deeds, as we'll soon learn as we progress in this shiur. As a matter of fact, Rav Yosef Zev Lupavitz, alav shalom, also known as the Nachalat Yosef, writes that when the story of Ruth took place, the level of chesed that should have existed in the heart of Am Yisrael was very much lacking. He says that Am Yisrael was weak and they were deficient in the area of true chesed, of greatness in the area of chesed. So in order to fill that deficiency, a non-Jewish woman, a soul that was not born Jewish, that was actually rich in chesed, was taken and planted in Am Yisrael. Which means that the arrival of Ruth into the Jewish people was like a transfusion of blood, like a blood transfusion into the body of the Jewish nation, which prepared them for a renewed life. Because embedded in the heart of Ruth HaMoaviyah was the great spirit that brought to the world messianic strength and hope, which is something the people needed and were longing for. The Rambam, alav shalom, writes in Ilchot Teshuvah that the greatness of Mashiach is that he'll bring changes in the relationships between people and between nations, and that he's going to remove barriers between them. And where does this source of his strength flow from? He says from Ruth. Think about it. Ruth's story is a statement of lasting faith in the face of unexpected hardships. You need strength to be able to endure and to proceed in the way that Ruth did. Ruth was a Moaviyah, a princess who left her life of luxury, who left the royal palace behind and wound up a poverty-stricken widow. Yet she made every twist of her story into a turn for the better, with strength and determination, and above all else, great kindness, extraordinary kindness, and illogical kindness. That's the spiritual DNA required for a messianic seed to blossom in the world. So with that in mind, ladies, I want to begin the shiur, and I want to point out that this class is going to be divided into two parts. Today's class is part 1, and next week we're going to continue with part 2 because we have so very much to cover. Most of the chidushim you're going to hear in this 2-part lecture are taken from a sefer titled Tzor Hamor that was written by the great Rabbi Avraham Saba, alav shalom, who we're going to refer to as Rabbi Avraham. So you know, whenever we say Rabbi Avraham, you know who it is. It's Rabbi Saba. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Rabbi Avraham lived in the mid-1400s in Castile, Spain, during the time of the Inquisition, during the time of the expulsion of Jews from Spain. And he actually fled from there to Portugal. And not too long after he settled in the city of Oporto, the king of Portugal ordered that all Jews be expelled and that all Jewish children become Christians. The king also demanded that all Hebrew books be burned. If that were not enough, Rabbi Avraham's 2 sons were taken from him, and he had to run away from Oporto, leaving his entire library of books behind. The only thing that he managed to take with him, to smuggle out of Portugal, at great risk to his life, were some of his written manuscripts. He fled to Lisbon, and before getting there, he was told that the king decreed death to any Jew who was caught with a Jewish book, a Hebrew book, or his pair of tefillin. Ladies, could you imagine the torture that these Jewish people had to endure? So Rabbi Avraham hid his manuscripts and his tefillin under an olive tree before he entered the city of Lisbon. And when he wanted to leave the city, he tried to recover his hidden items, but sadly, the king's soldiers saw him, they arrested him, and they threw him into prison. After 6 months, he was released, and he ran away to the city of Fez in Morocco. Sadly, right after he arrived in Fez, he became so sick due to the terrible nisyonot that he suffered, which undermined his health. And unfortunately, 10 years later, he died at the age of 68. He wrote 2 Sfarim and Megillat Ruth. And we're going to be learning the Chidushim from one of them, as we said, titled Tzor Hamor. So let's begin. Let's begin because we've got a lot to do. Ladies, we all know the basic story of Ruth HaMoaviyah. There was a fellow named Elimelech who was married to a woman named Naomi. They had 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion. Elimelech was an extremely wealthy fellow, but because there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael where they were living in Bethlehem, he was concerned that he'd have to financially support the entire community. So the Yetzer Hara got the better of him, and he abandoned the Jewish people, and he moved away with his entire family to the city of Moab, to Sdei Moab, the fields of Moab. Regrettably, we know the story too well, that when someone moves out of a holy environment and he moves to a place where there's a lot of tumah, he puts his entire family at risk that they may decline in their levels of spirituality, or God forbid, even worse, intermarry. And our rabbis tell us that even if a person moves to a place that he assumes has some semblance of Torah, because there are yeshivot over there, or shuls, and Jewish people, but because the entire city or the entire state or country is filled with tum'ah, it's still a risk that this person is taking, that his children's spirituality will eventually decline. And people don't understand that this is a risk that they're taking, and they're taking chances with the future of their children and children's children after that. But for today's class, we're going to accept the opinion of the Zohar Kadosh that tells us that Ruth HaMoaviyah and her sister Orpah, who were Gentile women, did indeed convert before they married Elimelech's 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion. Machlon married Ruth and Kilion married Orpah. So we're going to keep that fact in the back of our minds as we proceed. We're going to go according to the opinion of the Zohar Kadosh that says they converted before they got married. We also know that as a result of Elimelech's abandonment of the people, he lost all of his wealth and he died. Machlon and Kilion also died. They were punished. And at this point in the Megillah, Naomi is left alone with only her 2 daughters-in-law. And the question was, would these 2 sisters, Orpah and Ruth, remain in Moab, or go back with Naomi to Eretz Yisrael, back to Bethlehem? And it's from this point that we're going to be analyzing the story. Now, ladies, if you look in the first parak of Megillat Ruth, it tells us that Orpah decided to stay behind, while Ruth journeys on to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. The pasuk in Perek Aleph states, Vatashav Naomi, and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, Verut HaMoaviyah Chalata Ima, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, was with her. Hashava Misde Moab, who returned from the fields of Moab. Ladies, this pasuk needs to be examined because Naomi coming back to her homeland is understandable. When the Megillah uses the word Vatashov and she returned, it makes sense that Naomi returned because she used to live in Eretz Yisrael. She moved away to Sde Moab and now she was coming back. Vatashov, she's coming back. But then the pasuk tells us that Ruth, her daughter-in-law, Hashava Misde Moab, she also returned. She was returning. Well, how was Ruth returning if she never lived in Eretz Yisrael in the first place? Nor did she leave from Eretz Yisrael in order to return. This was her first time traveling to Bethlehem. So why does the Megillah use the word Hashava, that she returned? It's a question we need to address. So Rabbi Avraham actually discusses the first part of this pasuk, and he writes that it's coming to teach us the praise of Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. That's the first lesson. It's also teaching us that sometimes Hashem brings many yisurim, many challenges upon a tzaddik, like he did to Naomi. And after Naomi accepted upon herself all the yisurim, all the nisyonot, the trials and tribulations that were decreed upon her, and she overcame them. And not only that, says Rabbi Avraham, but Amra shesibata haya kol zeh, she admitted that all the tragedy that came upon her family was as a result of her bad choices. She said it was her fault and that she deserved it. Right after she admits that she could have prevented all of this pain and suffering and the death of her family, the pasuk tells us that she and her daughter-in-law Ruth returned to Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Avraham says that we're told this in order to show us al chasiduta v'tzidkuta shel Naomi, to emphasize her piety and righteousness. What makes Naomi a tzadikah? A righteous woman. And it's now that Rabbi Avraham discusses an important psychology that actually the Gemara addresses. And that's the psychology of the relationship between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So all you mothers-in-law out there and all you daughters-in-law out there, please listen very attentively to this. And if you feel that it doesn't apply to you, don't worry, it might apply to the next generation. So you could teach it to, there's always the yotzim min haklal. But the Gemara says that generally 99.9999% of the time, what I'm about to teach you is the psychology of what takes place in that relationship between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law. The Gemara tells us that the relationship between a mother-in-law and her daughter-in-law is not the optimal relationship. The Gemara actually describes it as a rivalry. And the Rabbanim don't seem to mince any words concerning this rivalry, because they say it straight out in the Gemara that they hate each other. The term is a sinah. And Rabbi Avraham says, listen to his wording, שידוע בטבע הנשים שהחמיות שונות לקלות והקלות להחמיות. It's known, as the Gemara says, that the nature of women is such that the mothers-in-law hate their daughters-in-law and the daughters-in-law hate their mothers-in-law. That's generally speaking. We're not talking about the exceptions to the rule. The hate, according to the Gemara, is mutual. What's the reason for this sin'ah, says Rabbi Avraham? לפי שהאישה אוהבת את בנה שנצטערה עליו בעוברה. The mother loves her son so much because of all the pain that she endured from the moment that this baby was a fetus in her womb. She worked very hard and she suffered a great deal in order to bring this baby boy into the world. She endured a difficult and life-threatening labor. And then when the baby was born, she actually nursed him from her own bosom and from the milk that was produced from her own body. She raised this boy with tremendous anguish. Who raises the children? The mother. So he writes, Bayom, Balayla, she deals with this baby boy day and night. And after all this, מלמדתהו בדרך נכון. She educates him as to what the proper path in life is. She directs his ruchaniyut. Who is available and actually present when a child comes home from school? The mother. Who feeds the child? The mother. Who does homework with the child? The mother. Who's the one that has time to sit down and talk about emotional things, about life? The mother. The mother is dealing with this child from the moment he's conceived until he grows up and gets married. Continues Rabbi Avraham. V'chol ta'avata u'tshukata. And all her desire and yearning is for what? Lehasiyo isha u'lachniso lachuppah. She just wants to find him a good wife and walk him down to the chuppah. That's supposed to be the goal of every Jewish mother. Every mother wants to see her son married. And after all this, once she finds a nice girl and the son is married, when he begins to embrace his new wife, he begins to love this new wife as himself, kenafsho. And suddenly, the love that he once shared with his mother is not as strong as it used to be, because there's a new person in his life who he's devoting most of his attention and time to and love to. And all the love that he feels now is directed towards whom? To his new wife. As the Pasuk says in Sefer Bereshit, Al ze ya'azov ish et aviv ve'et imo. For the reason of marriage, a man leaves his father and mother v'davak be'ishto, and he attaches himself to his wife. This is something the Torah Kedosha tells us very clearly. So what happens? The mother comes along and says, Asher tipachti v'ribiti oivi chilam. I toiled and I agonized over this child so much. I raised him, I taught him, I did so much for him, and he leaves me for this woman over here? It seems that the mother naturally feels betrayed, and there's an automatic animosity that's developed in her against the daughter-in-law. The mother feels as if her son's bride is kind of like a competition. The opposite is also true, by the way. Says Rabbi Avraham, V'chen hakala sonat hamota. The daughter-in-law also hates her mother-in-law. Why does she hate her mother-in-law? So the simple explanation that the Rabbanim offer is that generally, you learn to hate the people who hate you. The rabbis say, if someone shows you disdain, if someone is not nice to you, if someone treats you and rejects you, if someone acts towards you with animosity, you are going to reciprocate those feelings whether you want to or not, because it becomes a mirror image of the feelings that are initially displayed and projected towards you. That's the simple explanation. But Rabbi Avraham says that it's deeper than that. Listen to his wording. לפי שהיא עזבה אביה ואימה ואוהבת בעלה. This girl made a tremendous sacrifice, this young girl. She left the comfort of her mother and father's home, and she moved away to live with her new husband. לפי שהיא קצת פטורה ממצוות התורה, לפי שרשות בעלה עליה. When she gets married, this girl, she's no longer obligated to engage in many mitzvot because her obligation is to her husband and to the house. ואת ברית אלוקיה שכחה. And that could cause her to forget the covenant with her God. Which means that this young girl, by virtue of the fact that she left her mother and father's house where she was free to engage in the mitzvot however and whenever she saw fit, is now leaving that house in order to attach herself to her husband. And as a result of that, she's sacrificing on some level her own spiritual elevation. She might just forget her deep-rooted brit with Hashem because she's busy tending to her household. She might forget. And that to her is a tremendous sacrifice, says Rabbi Avraham. As a matter of fact, Avud Raham alav shalom tells us that the reason why women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot, from mitzvot aseh she'azman grama, is because the woman's time does not belong to her anymore once she gets married. That time is now dedicated to the household, to her husband, to all her obligations to the house. There are certain things that a woman has to tend to in the home that have to take place at a certain time. And if that time conflicts with a mitzvah, she's exempt from that mitzvah. For example, if they tell a woman that she has to recite Kriyat Shema by a certain time, like you're supposed to, she might not be able to tend to her household obligations because she's bound by that mitzvah that has to take place at a given time. And therefore, the house might be neglected because she's busy with all these time-bound mitzvot. Therefore, she's exempt from those mitzvot aseh she'azman grama. But Rabbi Avraham is saying that this girl over here is making a big sacrifice by marrying her chatan. She's thinking, you know, I left my mother and my father where I was free to engage in mitzvot and elevate myself, and now I'm leaving many mitzvot behind that I was able to perform because I'm marrying this man. Vekarta brit im ba'ala. She entered into a covenant with her husband by becoming intimate with him. And even though she knows now that she's bound to her husband through marriage, באופן שבכל זה, היא חושבת שבעלה יש לו ברית כרותה עם אמו. And even though she sacrificed so much to marry this man, she still thinks that her husband has his own bond that he sealed with his mother. In other words, she's always thinking, you love your mother more than you love me. Sound familiar? Why do you defend your mother but you don't defend me? Why do you always have time to help your mother but you never have time to help me? Why don't you speak up when your mother tells me something that makes me feel badly? Which means that the new wife is thinking, after everything I gave up in order to be with you, I left my parents' home, I gave up many mitzvot, I suffer in order to produce children for you, I take care of the house and all of the household obligations, I try to be an ezer kenegdo, and your mother says one word to me and you take her side? Says Rabbi Avraham, the kala also feels betrayed by virtue of her mother-in-law's existence which threatens her relationship with her husband. He continues, עד שבסיבת זו נעשו צרות ואויבות זו לזו. It comes to a point that as a result of all of this tension that each of them feels and thinks, and the animosity or the competition, that many troubles and problems occur, and the two of them become enemies, one with the other. And with this, Rabbi Avraham explains a pasuk in Parashat Chayei Sarah. Ladies, do you remember when Yitzchak married Rivka? The pasuk says, "Vayivi'eha ha'ohela Sarah imo." Sarah, Yitzchak brought Rivka into the tent of his mother Sarah. Vayinachem Yitzchak achrei imo. And Yitzchak was consoled due to his mother Sarah. Well, what does it mean that he was consoled? Vayinachem. Don't forget that Sarah was no longer alive when Yitzchak got married. So let's do the math. When Yitzchak was involved in the Akedah, he was 37 years old. On that day, Sarah died. And he only got married 3 years later when he was 40 years old. So Sarah Imenu Alei Shalom was not alive for 3 years already. And here we're being told that after he brought Rivka into his mother's tent, Vayinachem, he became consoled. But only now he became consoled, or 3 years later? His mother was dead for 3 years. Only now you become consoled? How do we understand this? Simply speaking, Chachamim tell us that while Sarah was alive, there were 3 visible miracles that were present. There was a cloud of glory hovering over her tent. Her candles remained burning from 1 week to the next, and there was a special blessing in her dough. But when Sarah passed away, these miracles left together with her, so to speak. Yet suddenly, when Yitzchak brought Rivka into his mother's tent, he noticed that all those miracles returned. When he saw that, Vayinachem, he was consoled because it felt as if his mother had come back. He was happy that it was a sign from above that he married a woman who was spiritually on par with his mother, Sarah, Vayinachem, and he was consoled. That's the simple explanation. But Rabbi Avraham tells us something else. Listen to what he says. Ki lefi teva ha'anashim le'ehov et hanashim. It's the nature of men to be attracted to and to love women. V'shochachim ahavat ha'em. And as a result of that, once they begin to love another woman, they forget how much they love their mothers. Shegedalato v'gam ele tishkachach. And he forgets how much his mother went through in order to raise him. Ve'im efshar be'enav ba'et hahi ohevet eshet neurav. And if he displays the love that he feels towards his wife in front of his mother, imon hepachi le'oyevet. The mother turns into the enemy. The mother thinks, how can you love your wife more than me when I did so much for you than she did? I raised you, I bore you, I had you in my womb for 9 months, I did so much for you. Continues. V'zeu omram. And that's what the Rabbanim and the Midrash teach us. Ksheyadur ze'ev im keves, tadur kala im chamata. Oh, when the day will come that a wolf can dwell peacefully with little sheep, that's the day when a daughter, actually it's a lamb, keves, that's the day when a daughter-in-law will be at peace with her mother-in-law. You understand the depth of the rivalry here? It basically means we're being taught here that when Mashiach comes and there will be peace among all the creatures, that's when these two adversaries, the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, will be able to live in harmony. And then Rabbi Avraham says, "Ubechlal tir'eh v'lachen amar." And notice what the pasuk says. He says in Sefer Bereshit, "Vayikach et Rivka." Yitzchak married Rivka, "Vaye'ehaveha," and he loved her. Oh, he says that's a normal circumstance. He married Rivka and he began to love her. That's normal. But he writes, what would have happened if Sarah was alive and the pasuk would still say that Yitzchak took Rivka, he married her, vayehaveha, and he loved her? What would happen then? Rabbi Avraham says that it would have caused a rivalry between Sarah and Rivka and Sarah and Yitzchak. Do you believe this? He says, after all, don't forget that Yitzchak was Sarah's only child. Sarah suffered so much just to be able to have this child, to bring him into the world. She raised him and she was willing to sacrifice so much for him. And he says, and now what would happen? Her only pride and joy, Yitzchak, he goes, marries another girl and loves her. He loved Rivka vayehaveha. So what did Yitzchak Avinu say? Says Rabbi Avraham, כי כשראה יצחק שהייתה לו לאישה ויאהביה, when Yitzchak realized that he now had a wife and that he loved her, לקח נחמה גדולה על שכבר מתה אמו. He was greatly consoled by the fact that his mother was no longer alive. He said, I'm consoled to a certain degree that my mother is not alive anymore, because if my mother would be alive, it wouldn't be good. Why was he consoled? Because he loved Rivka. And if that love would have been displayed in front of his living mother, it would have caused a friction between Rivka and Sarah and between himself and his mother. So the consolation that he felt was that his mother wouldn't be around to see how much he loved Rivka. And that's why the consolation took place only 3 years later, because only now he got married and only now he developed a love for Rivka. It's a tremendous chidush. And the question is, what do we learn from Rabbi Avraham's words? He continues. And by the way, as you see, I'm literally opening up the Sefer for you, on behalf of you, so that we're learning exactly, like inside, what Rabbi Avraham says. He continues. ולכן אמר בקל, ותשוב נעמי ורות המואביה כלתה עמה. That's why the pasuk in Megillat Ruth goes out of its way to tell us that Naomi went back to Bethlehem, and who went with her? Ruth HaMoaviyah, Ruth the Moabite. But it wasn't just that it was Ruth HaMoaviyah. The pasuk tells us it was Kalata. She was her daughter-in-law. The Megillah is emphasizing Ruth's relationship to Naomi. He says, Lehorot ma'alata, to show us Naomi's incredible virtue. What virtue? Shedavka nafsha ba כאילו הייתה ביתה ממש. That Naomi attached herself to Ruth in such a way as if Ruth was her biological daughter mamash. אף על פי שכמעט מת מחלון בידה, even though Machlon, her son, died because he married Ruth. Remember that Machlon was Naomi's son. The logical thing, he says, for Naomi to have said was, you know, because of you, my son died. My son was perfectly healthy before he decided to marry a Moabite woman. He married you and he died. Naomi knew that her sons died because they married Moaviot, and they were punished for it. But, says Rabbi Avraham, Im kol zeh. But regardless of Naomi's natural instinct and the reaction she could have had, Ahavat olam ahavauta, she felt an eternal love for Ruth. Velo dai. And if that were not enough, what did Naomi do? Biksha la manoach asher yitav la. Who was the shadchan who facilitated Ruth's marriage? No one else but Naomi herself. Naomi saw to it that Ruth should be married to the person who would provide her with all the good in the world. which Rabbi Avraham says is against the nature of this kind of relationship. V'natna la etzah. Naomi was the one who advised Ruth, and she instructed her on exactly what she needed to do in order to inspire the union between herself and Boaz. Shelo keminhag hanashim. This is not the normal behavior given the nature of this relationship of mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. Sheyesh lahem kalot umetu ba'alehem shelo hayu rotzot sheinasu la'anashim la'olam. In many cases, there are certain women who lose their husbands, and the mother-in-laws don't want their daughters-in-law to remarry ever again. You were married to my son, and now he's gone. Zeo, why do you need to get remarried? I don't want you to get married to somebody else. If you were married to my son, you should remain loyal to him. He says, there's some cases that are like this. Ushehem nosod baal. And if the daughters-in-law do end up remarrying, יחרה להם עד מאוד יותר ממיתת בניהם. It bothers the mother-in-law much more than the actual death of her child, of her son. Can you imagine? Wow. Wow. ובכאן אמר, ותאמר לה נעמי חמותה. The Megillah goes out of its way to inform us that it was Naomi, her mother-in-law, who was talking to her, talking to Ruth. And why do we have to keep reading that it was Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law? You know why? He says, because the fact that Naomi cared, loved, and took care of Ruth in the manner that she did, the fact that she facilitated her remarriage to Boaz, goes against the nature of that relationship. That even though Naomi was Hamotah, she was her mother-in-law, she treated her like her own daughter, she loved her like her own child, and took care of her future as if she was one of her own children. And that's why the Pasuk in the Megillah is emphasizing that Naomi was Hamotah, her mother-in-law, and that Ruth was Kalata, her daughter-in-law. It's in order to demonstrate that although there should be a natural rivalry and tension between these two, the opposite was true. Both Ruth and Naomi were righteous women who went against the grain of what would instinctively and naturally occur in such a relationship. That's the psychological explanation offered to us by Rabbi Avraham Saba. But now I want to go back to the first question we asked regarding the pasuk that says, Vatashov Naomi, and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, Verut HaMoaviyah Kalata Ima, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, was with her, Hashava Mizdei Moav, who herself returned from the fields of Moab. If you remember, we wondered why the pasuk is telling us that Ruth returned from Sde Moab to Eretz Yisrael if she never left Eretz Yisrael in order to return. Naomi was the one who left Bethlehem and settled in Moab, and she was returning, but not Ruth. She didn't return from the fields of Moab. This was her first time in Eretz Yisrael. So why does the pasuk use the term Hashava Mizdeh Moab, that she returned from the fields of Moab? That's the question I'd like to address. And Rabbi Avraham explains very beautifully that Naomi did not return to Eretz Yisrael ela b'schut Ruth HaMoaviyah Kalata. This is astounding if you think about it, because he says that in actuality Naomi was not supposed to make it. She should have died together with her family back in Moab. What saved her? The relationship that she had with Ruth. So the pasuk is telling us, Vatashov Naomi, in what merit did Naomi return to Eretz Yisrael? Ve'Ruth haMoaviyah kalata ima. It's because Ruth, her daughter-in-law, was with her. That's why she merited to return. Ruth was like the good luck charm for Naomi. Why? Listen to these words. Shayta tzadeket gemura. Because Ruth was wholesomely righteous. And what was destined to be produced through Ruth? Ve'atid malchut David latzet mimena. The Davidic dynasty was destined to be born from Ruth. Therefore, malchut David, including Mashiach ben David, needed to be established in the world. That's why Naomi received the zchut of surviving. It was in order to facilitate the shidduch between Ruth and Boaz, so that the seed of Mashiach could be born into the world. Uzot hasiba shava Naomi, and that's the only zchut that allowed Naomi to survive and to return to Eretz Yisrael. It was in order to assist in the process of the birth of Mashiach. Ki be'ofen acher, keivan nigzera alea gzera. If it hadn't been for this process that needed to take place of the birth of Mashiach, we should know, he says, that it was already determined in Shamayim that Naomi was supposed to die together with the rest of her family. There was already a gzera, a verdict that was decreed upon her in the heavens. She was pronounced guilty in Shamayim for not doing enough to convince her husband to remain in Eretz Yisrael, for not speaking out when she saw the family issues taking place, occurring in Sdei Moav, that should have prompted her to save the family and plead with her husband to return to their homeland. So Rabbi Avraham is saying that the only reason the decree was overturned is due to Ruth and the kingdom that was meant to be established through her. So Rabbi Avraham is trying to show us what happens when a person chooses right from wrong. How so? Ladies, if Naomi would have behaved like the typical mother-in-law as depicted by the Gemara and Rabbi Avraham, like I read to you a few minutes ago, if she would have displayed resentment against her daughter-in-law after her sons died, she would have dismissed Ruth. She would have done away with her. She would have blamed her. Now, she wouldn't have hurt Ruth. She would have only brought tragedy upon herself, because her state of existence was only because of Ruth. It was in the zchut of Ruth. But because she tended to Ruth, cared for her, and treated her like her own child, she merited to live and facilitate the seed of Mashiach being born into the world. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the grandiosity of such a zchut? To know that you helped to bring David HaMelech alav shalom into the world, and by extension, the entire Davidic dynasty down to Mashiach ben David, who will redeem the entire world. So you know what it means when the pasuk says, "Ve'Ruth kalata ima hashava misde Moav." Says Rabbi Avraham, lomar שבזכות שהייתה מואבית ושבה בתשובה ונתגיירה ושבה משדה מואב. When the pasuk tells us that she returned, that Ruth returned, השבה משדה מואב, it doesn't mean that she physically left Eretz Yisrael and then she returned. Because we all know that she was never in Eretz Yisrael in order to leave, in order to return. Returned means she repented. Returned means she did teshuvah, hashava. She did teshuvah from the culture of Moab. Ruth was hashava misde Moab. She decided to disconnect herself from the Gentile ways of the Moabites and attach herself to the Jewish people. That's what Rabbi Avraham is telling us. שבזכות שהייתה מואבית ושבה בתשובה ונתגיירה. You know, it isn't easy for someone who grew up his entire life in a secular culture, following the Gentile laws and life, to suddenly disconnect himself from his upbringing, to suddenly adapt an entire new life that's completely in opposition to what he knows and how he lived. What Ruth did was considered a tremendous act, and it earned her an unequaled zechut. But now I want to begin to analyze this holy woman called Ruth. You should know, and we've learned this on several occasions, that there are certain neshamot that they're just extremely lofty in their spiritual makeup. And for whatever reason that we don't know of, that's revealed to us, the sitra achra, the dark side we call it, the other side, the klipot, the husks, the satan, the dark side, has a hold on these neshamot because the satan knows that they have such great spiritual potential. Therefore, these neshamot are held in captivity by the dark side, and it is at a certain point, through great preparation and spiritual strategies by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, these holy souls are released from their confinement. Ruth was one of these neshamot that was held in captivity by the dark side. Therefore, from the onset, Ruth had in her a great and lofty neshama. She was a very holy soul. It's just that the sitra achra didn't want to release her from its hold. And that's why she found herself in Sdei Moab, in the fields of Moab. But in actuality, her roots were not in Moab. Her neshama came from the higher worlds of Kedusha, of holiness. And that's what the Pasuk is telling us. Hashava Mizdei Moab. She was returning from the fields of Moab. She was released from the fields of Moab. She didn't belong there in the first place. Her neshama was originally in a very holy place. So in reality, Ruth was indeed returning. She was returning to her roots. She was returning to where she really belonged, to the Kedusha. And the Ari HaKadosh, Alav Shalom, writes something incredible. He says that the two sisters, Ruth and Orpah, they were very important neshamot, both of them. Following their husband's death, they both needed to make a decision regarding whether or not they'd continue with their conversion to Judaism and move away from Moab or not. Orpah renounced her conversion. Once her husband died, she no longer felt the need to progress any further with her conversion. And as a result, she left Naomi and went back to her old life, to her secular ways, and continued to live the life of a Moabite, doing all kinds of things and worshipping Avodah Zarah. Ruth, however, felt differently. She thought, although the original conversion was due to my husband, I don't want to abandon this way of life. I want to remain part of the Jewish nation, and I want to lead a Torah Jewish life. So the Arizal writes that at the time that Ruth and Orpah made their decisions, where Ruth decided to remain a Jew and Orpah decided to return to Moab, you know what happened? Hold on to your seats. There was a transference that took place. What transfer? He writes, any negative traits, any tumah from Moab that may still have been left inside of Ruth were transferred to Orpah. While any kedusha, any holiness that may still have been left in Orpah, was transferred to Ruth. So before they made their decision, each of them had in them a mixture of good and not so good. But once the decision was made, Ruth became the epitome of the ultimate good, possessing a pure neshama, while Orpah attained all the negative traits and tumah. Actually, the Holy Chida, alav shalom, in his Sefer Chomot Anach, tells us that there's actually a hint to this idea in the Pasuk in Tehillim that states, Shomer nafshot chasidav miyad reshaim yatzilem. God watches over the souls of the pious ones. He rescues them from the hands of the wicked. Says the Chida concerning this Pasuk. The nafshot chasidav, the pious souls in this Pasuk, is referring to Ruth HaMoaviyah. And how do we know that it's referring to her? Because he says the Sofei Tevot, the last letters of the words Shomer Nafshot Chasidav are Resh Vav Taf. And that spells the name Ruth. He says that Borei Olam protected Ruth's neshama miyad reshaim. Who's the wicked ones he was protecting her from? Says the Chida, that would be Orpah. And he goes on to write in his Sefer that if you take the letters in Orpah's name and you mix them around a little bit, you can spell the word He'afar, which means the dust of the earth. And who's associated with the Afar? The Nachash HaKadmoni, the epitome of Tumah. Ve'anachash afar lachmo. The snake, his sustenance comes from the dust of the earth. That was Orpah, says the Chida. Ruth, however, she has a very interesting name. Very interesting name. According to one interpretation, the name Ruth was the name she adapted once she converted. Ruth was not her original name. Ruth is actually a very holy name. So what's the secret behind this name? Ladies, I hope you're actually watching this because we're going to have some numbers and words coming up on the screen. So I would advise you, it should be for you a visual presentation. So what's the secret behind Ruth's name? He writes that the simple explanation is that the numerical value of the name Ruth equals 606. Now, a Gentile is only obligated to observe the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. But when Ruth converted, in addition to those 7 commandments that she was obligated to observe, an additional 606 were added, making it a grand total of 613, which we know are the amount of mitzvot in the Torah. Hence the name Ruth. 606 plus the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach. That's a simple explanation. But there's a deeper explanation as to why Ruth's name was Ruth. And the Chida reminds us that Ruth was from Moav. And we know that there was a very big controversy as to whether or not we could accept converts from Moav if they can marry into the Jewish nation. There were many people, there were many Rabbanim who believed that Ruth cannot be accepted. Although she converted, she was not accepted by everybody. And by extension, anybody who was born from her, they believed was not legitimate. Not everybody believed that, but many people did. However, the Chachamim and the Talmud discussed and analyzed the matter, and they came to the conclusion that this law against accepting Moavim does not apply to the women of Moab. The ban only applies to the men. Moavi velo Moaviyah. Therefore, it's the Rabbanim and the Talmud who found legitimacy in Ruth's conversion, as well as all her descendants, which again includes David HaMelech and his offspring, all the way down to Mashiach ben David. Now, the Mekubalim teach us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has many names by which he represents himself in the world. One of his names is the name of Adnut, which is pronounced Adonai and spelled Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud. We actually use that name before we begin praying, reciting the Tfilat HaAmidah, when we say Adonai Sifatai Tiftach Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha. So let's learn a little bit about the name of Adnut. The Arizal tells us that the name Adoshem, Aleph Dalet Nun Yud, is equal in gematria to 65. However, the Ari Kadosh says that 65 is just a simple math if you add up the letters Aleph, Dalet, Nun, and Yud. But in order to get to a deeper result, you have to, he says, open up the letters b'milui and do the math. Which means, how do we do that? We take the letters Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, we start to open it up in the sense that we take the first letter Aleph and we spell it out. How would we spell Aleph? Aleph, Lamed, Pei. If we add up the gematria of Aleph, Lamed, Pei, that brings us to a numerical value of 111. Aleph, Lamed, Pei is 111. Then we take the letter Dalet in the name of Adnut, and we would spell it out. How would we spell Dalet? Dalet would be spelled Dalet, Lamed, Taf, which equals 434. Then we would take the letter Nun and spell that out. Nun, Vav, Nun. Nun, Vav, Nun equals 106. And then we take the last letter of Adnut, which is a Yud, and we spell that out. That would be spelled Yud, Vav, Dalet. Yud, Vav, Dalet in gematria is equal to 20. Now if we add up all of those numbers, 111, 434, 106, and 20, we arrive at 671. Now that number might not mean anything to you, but the Mekubalim say that it's the letters of the word Tar'ah. Tar'ah is Taf, Resh, Ayin, Aleph. Tar'ah equals 671. What's Tar'ah? In Aramaic, it means a gate, a shar. So the Mekubalim write that whenever we see the name of Hashem of Adnut, this name, it refers to the gate of Tar'ah, the Tar'ah gate. What is this gate? I'll explain to you in a simple way. Our Torah is divided into two categories, which consists of Torah shebichtav, the written law, and Torah shebe'al peh, the oral law. Torah shebichtav is a little more difficult to understand because there are no explanations or interpretations in the Torah itself. The way we determine what HaKadosh Baruch Hu meant in the Torah shebichtav is through the oral law, through the Torah shebe'al peh, which interprets the Torah shebichtav. Those two go together. They cannot be separated. So the Torah shebe'al peh actually, says the Ari, becomes the gate that we enter into in order to understand the Torah shebichtav. I'm going to explain it to you in a deeper way. Notice what happened here. The letters you see in the name of Hashem, comprised of Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, were the only letters you saw. That's like the Torah shebichtav, because those are the letters you see in front of you, and you assume that there's nothing more than what you see. But the inner letters, like the ones we just discovered through the Ari, they would be considered like the Torah shebe'al peh, where we discovered what's hidden beneath the surface. And those are the letters that we did not see. We did not see those letters. We had to uncover them somehow, and we uncovered them by entering through this gate of Torah shebe'al peh. So let's analyze the inner letters for a moment. Those letters that represent the Torah shebe'al peh that we just discovered. We said earlier that when we open up the letters of Adnut, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, we came to many letters, right? Which totaled 671. Wonderful. So let's take 671 and deduct from that 65, which is the original total of the original letters. If remember, Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud. Let's deduct 65 from the revealed letters. 671 minus 65 is 606. 606 we know is the gematria of the name Ruth. So Ruth, Ari says, is the secret of the Torah shebe'al peh. And the Chida adds to that. Ruth represents the Torah shebe'al peh because her entire legitimacy rests and relies on the Torah shebe'al peh. Think about it. If we only went according to the Torah shebichtav, according to the written law, the law would be very precise with very little room to open any door, because it states very clearly, Lo yavo Moavi ve'amoni bekal Hashem. That's it. The Torah says to Ruth, you're out. You cannot be accepted. End of story. But if we open up the Torah shebe'al peh, which is this sha'ar, this Torah, the gate that we enter into in order to interpret the written law, there we find that Ruth is accepted and is indeed legitimate. Zeh hashar l'Adonai tzadikim yavo vo. Who enters through this shar? The tzadikim. Who's one of those tzaddikim? Ruth. From that gate of the Torah shebe'al peh, tzaddikim yavo vo, we discover the hidden tzaddikim in our midst. So, welcome Ruth HaMoaviyah, Baruch haba Ruth, Baruch haba David, Baruch haba Shlomo HaMelech, and Baruch haba Melech HaMashiach. We welcome all the tzaddikim that came from Ruth, who we discovered was legitimate through this gate of Torah shebe'al peh. Without the gate of the oral law, Ruth would have remained illegitimate, her and all her descendants. You know, ladies, sometimes a person makes a decision in life and he doesn't realize how pivotal that decision is going to be for himself, his children, and his entire future forever. Sometimes great consequences can come from the smallest decisions that we make. Imagine two people at a fork in the road. There's a decision that needs to be made. Should we go travel right or should we travel left? That decision seems like a minor one because it's just 2 feet that separates the road to the left from the road to the right. But if you take the road to the right, you end up on the east coast. And if you take the road to the left, you end up on the west coast. And when you finally arrive on the west coast, you wonder, oh, but how in heaven's name did I get here, Bichlal? How did this happen? You know how you got there? The one decision you made as you were standing at the crossroads of life changed your entire life. That's how one person ends up on one side of the world and another person ends up on the other side of the world. At the time you made your decision, it did not seem so significant. Therefore, every decision in life has to be weighed, and you have to know that at the time that you're making that decision, You have to consider the future and how what appears to be an insignificant decision can put you on a road that can lead you further and further away from the truth and from your destiny. Why am I telling you this? We were just talking about Ruth and Orpah. Ruth and Orpah were standing at this fork in the road. The question was, are they going to accompany Naomi back to Eretz Yisrael or not? It may not have seemed like such a big decision to make because nobody knew about the possibility of David HaMelech, of his son Shlomo HaMelech, of the Davidic dynasty, of the Mashiach. Nobody knew what the future held. All they saw was this fork in the road and the decision that has to be made of either yes to accompany Naomi or no, or go back to their life. Even Naomi was encouraging them to go back. Naomi asked them to go back to his father's house where they could live out the rest of their lives like princesses. She told them she couldn't offer them anything. Not money, not food, not children that she could produce for them to marry. So it seemed like a very simple decision to make given the circumstance. 1 + 1 = 2. Orpah looked at the fork in the road and said, you know what? I think I will go home after all. I think I will. And she takes the road to the left. Ladies, do you know what kind of decision Orpah made at that moment? You know what it did to Orpah and her entire history? You know who descended from Orpah? We're going to answer these questions and continue to reveal the secret of Ruth's name, Be'ezrat Hashem, next week when we continue part 2 of this shiur. I want to wish you all an amazing week, a holy week, a week of tremendous yeshuot ve'berachot, and Be'ezrat Hashem, let's hope that we can greet the Mashiach before I even finish this shiur. And if not, we'll continue to talk about Ruth in the tent of Mashiach, Be'ezrat Hashem. Have a wonderful week.